Yes, if we want to analyze the story of Prophet Joseph seriously, we should not treat it as just a religious tale. From the perspectives of psychology, sociology, narrative technique, and story architecture, it is one of the most complex and integrated narratives in the Qur'an. I'll keep it precise but still natural and easy to follow. Psychological analysis. The story of Joseph is exceptional because it contains almost all the major layers of human psychology: jealousy, desire, fear, loneliness, hope, self-control, suffering, patience, power, and forgiveness. The brothers' jealousy, comparison and relative deprivation. The story begins with a family problem, not with war, not with a miracle. The brothers feel that Joseph and Benjamin are more loved. Here, an important psychological mechanism appears: relative deprivation. People do not suffer only because they lack something in an absolute sense. Sometimes they suffer because they feel that someone else has more. So the issue is not just the father's affection. The issue is that the brothers experience themselves, in comparison to Joseph, as less valued. That is the point where jealousy stops being just an emotion and turns into a project. Jealousy becomes dangerous when, instead of improving the self, it tries to remove the object of comparison. Joseph, a personality with strong self-regulation. Throughout the story, Joseph shows unusually high self-mastery. Look at the pattern: he is thrown into a well, but he does not collapse. He is sold into slavery, but he does not lose his identity. He faces temptation, but he does not disintegrate. He is imprisoned, but he does not become bitter and vengeful. He gains power, but he is not intoxicated by power. So his personality is not just morally pure. Psychologically, he shows very high resilience. Resilience means the capacity to preserve inner structure when the outside world is putting pressure on you. Joseph is an example of a person who is not defined by circumstances. At every stage, he reorganizes himself rather than dissolving into the crisis. The wife of the minister, desire, pressure, and control crisis. This part of the story is psychologically very advanced. It is not just about personal temptation. Several forces are operating at once: personal attraction, unequal power, secrecy and enclosure, social pressure, reputation, denial, projection. When the minister's wife is frustrated, she tries to shift blame. That is a classic defense mechanism: projection. A person attributes inner tension or guilt to someone else in order to preserve self-image. On the other side, Joseph is not just resisting private desire. He is facing a full psychological social situation in which power, desire, and reputation are all entangled. Prison, suffering that deepens the personality. In many stories, prison is just a pause. In Joseph's story, prison is a major stage of formation. Prison does three things for him. It removes him from impulsive movement. It deepens his insight. It prepares the ground for his later role. From the perspective of developmental psychology, this fits an important pattern. Suffering, if it does not destroy a person, can deepen the structure of the self. Put simply, some people come out of crisis only wounded. Others come out of it ripened. Forgiveness at the end, beyond revenge. When Joseph reaches power, he has the perfect opportunity to settle the score. But he does not take revenge. This matters a lot, because many people look moral only when they are weak. The real test comes when power returns. Joseph's forgiveness is not simple forgetfulness. It shows that he has moved suffering from the level of personal injury to the level of meaning. He is no longer focused only on, what did they do to me? He can now see, what did this whole path become? That is rare psychological maturity. Sociological analysis. The story of Joseph is not only about an individual. Behind it, there is a whole social world, family, economy, class, power, gender, prison, government, and food crisis. The family is the first arena of power. The first crisis happens inside the family, not in the larger society. That is significant, because sociology tells us that the family is not only a place of affection. It is also the first institution where power, attention, status, and rivalry are distributed. The brothers are competing for position. Joseph is not just a brother. He represents a privileged emotional position within the family structure. So the well is not just a well. It is the result of a status struggle inside the family institution. Slavery and the conversion of a human being into a commodity. Joseph moves from the well to the market. That shift is sociologically important. A human being is transformed from a family member into an object of exchange. The story suddenly moves us into the world of economy and power. This shows that the Joseph narrative is not only moral, it also pays attention to material social structures. The human body, labor potential, beauty, and social position all enter a system of valuation. The minister's house, class, power, and concealment. The house of the minister is not just a house. It is a structure of power. In that space, Joseph is subordinate. The minister's wife belongs to a higher class position. Scandal must be controlled. Public appearance matters more than truth. That is exactly how hierarchical societies often behave. The preservation of image can matter more than justice. That is why, even when Joseph's innocence becomes more visible, he still ends up in prison. Why? Because power structures do not always move according to truth. They often move according to crisis management. Prison, the gathering place of the marginalized. Prison here is not just a location. It is a micro-society. In prison, the marginalized, the failed, and the victims of power accumulate. But what is striking is that Joseph becomes a center of trust even there. His legitimacy does not come from official office. It comes from symbolic capital. In sociological language, before he gains administrative power, he gains moral and interpretive authority. People sense that this person understands something. From family drama to governance and public crisis. One of the biggest differences in Joseph's story is that it moves from intimate family conflict to state-level governance. The issue is not only saving one person. The issue becomes managing a collective crisis. The king's dream, Joseph's interpretation, and the grain storage policy shift the narrative to the macro-social level. Forecasting, planning, resource management, governance under scarcity. Joseph is not only a spiritual figure here. He becomes a crisis manager. That is unusual. In many stories, the hero is simply rescued. Here, after personal suffering, the hero enters social responsibility. Narrative style. From the perspective of storytelling technique, the story of Joseph is one of the most mature narratives in the Qur'an. Continuous and cinematic narration. Unlike most Quranic stories, this one is not fragmented. It is continuous. That continuity allows the audience to witness gradual character development, follow cause and effect, experience suspense, feel that the ending grows naturally from the path. In modern terms, the story is highly cinematic. It unfolds scene by scene. The opening dream, the well, the caravan, the palace, the closed doors, the shirt, the prison, the royal court, the famine. The brothers' return, the recognition, the ending. Each part works almost like a sequence. Narrative economy. The story is long but not loose. It does not feel wasteful. Important elements return later with function. For example, Joseph's first dream finds its meaning at the end. The shirt appears at several key moments. Prison becomes the platform for political ascent. Famine becomes the mechanism that brings the brothers back. That means the narrative has high structural economy. Very little is narratively useless. Repeating motifs with growing meaning. Certain elements repeat, but each time with a deeper function: the shirt. Dreams. Concealment and revelation. Loss and return. Separation and reunion. These repetitions do not just add literary beauty. They create cohesion. It is like music, the main theme returns, but each time with greater depth. Suspense and gradual disclosure. The audience is constantly held in suspense. What will happen after the well? What will happen in the minister's house? Will he leave prison? Will the brothers recognize him? Will he take revenge or forgive? This suspense keeps the narrative alive. And just as important is the gradual release of information. The story does not explain everything at once. It lets meaning unfold in stages. Story structure. Now let's look at the architecture more formally. The story of Joseph has a very complete and disciplined arc. Opening, promise and crisis. The story begins with a dream. That dream is both a promise and a problem. From the beginning, the distant end is hinted at in symbolic form. But immediately after that, the crisis begins. This is a very strong structural move. First show the horizon, then initiate the fall. Deep descent. Joseph falls into increasingly difficult states: the well, estrangement, slavery, accusation, prison. From a structural point of view, this is the compression of crisis. The protagonist must reach a point where, outwardly, every path seems closed. Turning point. The interpretation of dreams in prison, and then the king's dream, forms the main turning point. But what matters is this: the turn does not feel sudden or artificial. The narrative has already planted the seed for it, so the reversal grows organically out of the character and the path. The second climax, confrontation with the brothers. If we think Joseph's rise to power is the ending, the structure feels incomplete. The real climax comes when he faces his brothers again. Why? Because the deepest wound in the story was not prison or poverty. It was the original family rupture. So the narrative does something structurally intelligent. It brings the protagonist back to the source of pain. Final resolution, restoration of order. At the end, it is not just a simple reconciliation. Several layers are resolved at once. Personal trauma, family fracture, economic crisis, narrative promise from the opening dream. This is a very complete ending. It gathers both the outer world and the inner world. 5. Why does this story feel so different? When we bring all these dimensions together, the reason becomes clearer. The story of Joseph is not only about prophethood, not only about miracle, not only about punishment, not only about private morality. It is a full narrative of human life unfolding through time. It contains suffering, desire, politics, economy, family, power, and finally, meaning. That is why it feels surprisingly modern. Because it is close to real life. In real life too, one single event usually does not explain everything. A person moves from one crisis to another, and only years later understands that some falls were part of the path. Final summary. If I had to compress it, from the perspective of psychology, Joseph's story is about jealousy, self-regulation, resilience, and maturity through forgiveness. From the perspective of sociology, it is about family, class, slavery, reputation, prison, and governance under crisis. From the perspective of narrative style, it is continuous, cinematic, economical, and built on suspense and recurring motifs. From the perspective of story structure, it has a complete arc, promise, fall, trial, reversal, return, and restoration. And maybe the most important point is this: The story of Joseph does not simply say, a good person wins in the end. It says something more subtle. Sometimes meaning becomes visible only when you see the whole journey, not one fragment of it. If you want, the next step can be to analyze it through the three-act structure in the hero's journey and compare it to modern storytelling models.